Tonight, I want to ask you a question, and you'll discuss it later in your discussion time. But this is the question. What is your personal definition of success? I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as you watch this, and then I want you to share when you're discussing with one another what it was before this video, and then maybe what it is after this video. What is your personal definition of success? I think for most people, their definition of success means winning. It means achieving something big, getting the grades, the relationship, the spot on the team, the recognition. Come on, somebody. We all love to be recognized. But what if God's definition of success is completely different from ours? In our story, 1 Samuel chapter 4, in fact, I want to encourage you, pause this now and jump back into the video after you've read this, 1 Samuel chapter 4. In our story, the Israelites thought that bringing the Ark of the Covenant into battle would guarantee their victory. They thought it would guarantee them their victory, but instead of winning, they were actually defeated. And the Ark, this box, if you will, really represented God's presence, but also just represented God himself. And so you could say that they were treating God like a good luck charm. The thing that they saw as a symbol of success actually became the symbol of their downfall. And I think the reason is, it's because they wanted results without the relationship. They didn't want the relationship. If they did, they would have consulted God. Now, other times in the scripture, when the ark was moved, and it was moved many times in many places, other times it's recorded that the leaders always asked God first. But in this story, they didn't. And the author wants us to know that's not a good sign. What did they want? They wanted victory without surrender. And by the way, if you want God to fight your battles throughout life, you can't bypass you can't bypass surrender to get to victory. That's just not how God works. And I've learned this as well. If I have to disobey God, meaning if I can't consult God when it comes to what I want, that's a good indicator. I might be following myself rather than the Lord. Now, let's zoom out. Let's look at this story from a big picture perspective, shall we? The Israelites wanted what every other nation at the time wanted. They wanted victory over their enemies. They wanted control. They wanted power. Essentially, they were getting their definition of success from the nations around them instead of God himself. And I just wonder, how often do we do that? How often do we look at somebody else's life and think, that's it, that's what I want, instead of asking the Lord what it is he wants for our life? If it's okay with you, I just want to share some wisdom that I've had to learn the hard way. God's purpose is not to make us successful by the world's standards. It's true. More often than not, we think that following Jesus is about living our best life now. And we think that God's purpose in life is to help us find the spouse, pass the test, win the game, make us rich, or even to live a problem-free life. I'm sorry to break the news to you. That is not God's purpose. It's not even close to the way that he sees success for our life. If you want to get really technical, God's purpose is to be glorified. It's true. It's that you and I would give God all the glory that he deserves. And if we miss that, then we risk becoming people who care more about God's hand than God's heart. And what we'll do, whether we realize it or not, is we'll treat faith like a formula. thinking we can somehow earn God's approval, God's blessing, thinking if I pray enough, if I worship enough, if I read enough, if I go to church enough, then God owes me something. That's never true. God doesn't owe you and I anything. Now, hear me. God's plan for your life, for my life, goes so much beyond just making us happy, healthy, and wealthy. We want a gospel of success, but God has offered us a gospel of surrender. And if it's okay with you, for the next few moments, I want to talk about how you know you've bought into a gospel of success. There's 3 things. Write these down. I think these are going to be powerful. I think these are going to be important. But you know you've bought into a gospel of success when you can't accept defeat. I think that's one of the things that this story reveals to us. The Israelites couldn't accept defeat. They couldn't accept the fact that things just didn't go the way that they had planned. And so one of the ways that you realize that the gospel of success is driving your life is that you can't accept defeat. And more than that, when the gospel of success drives your life, your first reaction to struggle will always be strategy instead of surrender. It will always be strategy instead of prayer. But if our first reaction is to lean on our own understanding instead of doing what the scriptures say when it says trust in the Lord with all of your heart, we might have bought into a gospel of success. The next thing is this. When you and I question God's faithfulness, when things don't go our way, we might have bought into a gospel of success. Let me ask you this question. When was the last time you let go of what you thought God wanted for you and you embraced what He actually had for you? When was the last time that you let go of what you think God wanted for you, which, by the way, really is just you thinking you know what you want for yourself? When was the last time you let that go and you actually were willing to embrace what God had for you? I think all too often we don't want to do that because it requires us to let go of control. But listen, if you are attempting to control, then you are not crying out. Crying out means I'm desperate. God, I want your will. I want your plan for my life. When was the last time you let go of what you thought you wanted and you actually embraced what God had for you? And finally, when the only time you play by God's rules is when you think it will get you what you want. Ooh. When the only time you pray, the only time you read, the only time you worship, the only time you go to church or go to youth or share your faith is to get God to do what you want, you have bought into a gospel of success. God is not a genie who we can manipulate. He doesn't give us 3 wishes. God is so much more beyond anything that we could ever understand. And more than that, if He becomes something that we can control, someone we think we can control, then I would just submit that maybe it's not God we're following. It's actually a form of God that we have made up for ourselves. If God is controlled, if God is easily controlled only by what you want, that's not a God worth following. Because the God of the universe sees it all, He knows it all, He has it all, and He is willing to give it all. And all of that was already exemplified through His Son, Jesus. Now, all of this conversation about the gospel of success versus control, or the gospel of success versus the gospel of surrender, begs the question, what is success? And this is where I'm going to challenge your personal definition of success, if you have one. This is what I heard somebody say one time when it comes to the definition of success. Write this down. Success is God's will, God's way, God's timing. true. Success is God's will. It's God's way. It's God's timing. Meaning it is God's plan, not mine. It's God's way, meaning it's how he does things or how we should do things according to his word versus what I think I should do. And it's God's timing, meaning I can patiently wait for it because it's God's plan. If I can't wait for it, more often than not, that's not his plan for my life. God's plan requires patience, and success is God's timing. And listen, this is not about getting what we want from God. This is about submitting to his lordship. It's about giving him ultimately what he deserves, our trust, our heart, and really our surrender. And now, listen, because I don't want you to miss this. I've been following Jesus now for close to 15 years. And it's taken me a long time to realize this, but I'm going to share it in hopes that it saves you a lot of trouble. The more I've matured in Christ, the more I've matured in my relationship with God, the more I've realized that God himself is the trophy that my heart desires. God himself. Because there's nothing else in this life that can satisfy except God himself. I like how one theologian put it. There is a God-sized hole in each and every one of our hearts that only God can fill. There's no relationship. There's no amount of money. There's no amount of status, achievement, or anything else that can ever satisfy that hole that only God can fill. And so I think all of that leads me to say this. Maybe the question we should ask ourselves is not, am I succeeding, or will this help me be more successful? Maybe the question we should ask ourselves is, am I surrendering? Because I think in the surrendering is where I find my success. If I can surrender, then I don't need to worry about those other things because God has my back. God cares more about the things in my heart than I care about. And listen, and here's what I've found, and I think your leaders can say the same thing. When I submit my desires to the Lord, and I just make my priority and my focus on surrendering and my relationship with him, all those other things that I thought I had to worry about, I never had to worry about. God has always saw through all of my fears. When I felt like I wouldn't find anybody, God saw through my fears. When I never felt like I had enough money, God saw through all my fears. When I didn't know where my future would take me, God saw through all my fears. When I didn't know where my next friend would come from because I was lonely and I was by myself, God saw through my fears. God sees through your fears too. And so here's what I would challenge you to do. Make God's definition of success your definition of success. Because that is when you will find true success. When God's definition of success becomes your definition of success, you will find true success in this life. Don't grasp for what the world thinks is important. Let it go and embrace what God says is important through his word.